may know who missed this program. I also just want to ask if you guys could keep your mics on mute while Laura Coyle presents this wonderful program to prevent any kind of outside noise from coming in there. Please do feel free to add questions to the chat. I will be monitoring it and we will have time to answer chat questions later. So without further ado, thank you very much, Dr. Coyle.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the nice introduction, Melanie. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. I see some familiar names on the screen and faces, and I thank you for coming. The East End Library was a big resource for me this summer. In fact, it helped me write this talk, the original version of this talk. And my library was back down in Bethesda, and I couldn't get into the museum, but clams got me everything I needed in order to write this talk. So I'm very grateful for that. So my name is Laura, and you're welcome to put questions in the chat. I will wait till the end to take the questions, just it'll be easier for me to keep track of where I am in the program, but I mean, I'm anxious to hear what you have to say in your questions. So I've divided this talk into two parts. One is about the building of the African American Museum of History and Culture, which is based on a really old dream. And the second part is going to be about the area that I work in, which is the invisible digital foundation of the new museum. Let me share my screen here. Takes a minute for it to load. I hope. There we go. Oops. All right. Are you seeing the presentation on the screen?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, and I'm going to use the slideshow vision, which will give you just one picture at a time. How's that? Good? Okay, great. So we have some wonderful photographs of the museum here, and I'm proud to say that it's my team that arranged to have these photographs made, and it was one of the impetuses for the talk, because we had so much good documentation. So let's see. The museum opened in September 2016. We're coming up on our 5th anniversary, and it's been a really huge success, much more than anyone who worked at the museum, even those of us who were most wishing for its success could have ever dreamed. From the day we opened until last January, we had about, well, from the first day, from that opening day on September 16th until the 1st of January, we had 730,000 visitors. And since the opening, we've had about 6 million visitors. Of course, the museum has mostly been closed to the public since the pandemic has hit, but we've kept our programming active online, and I'll plug all those online programs. Please check out the website for programs from the museum. The building from the outside has a 3-tiered corona or crown, and it was inspired in part by the headdress of a Rubens sculpture by Aloe Abaisi. Inside, there are 3 subterranean floors, the Great Hall on the main floor, and then the 4 floors above. The 3 floors on the bottom, the furthest below ground, are the history galleries in 3 sections. There's slavery and freedom, and I'm showing you 2 from that section. Segregation, or defining freedom, defending freedom, about the era of segregation, and a changing America. These provide the literal and the actual foundation of the museum. The most important galleries set the tone for the rest of the museum, and that is to tell the truth about the history and the contributions of people of African descent in the United States and then earlier in America. Sometimes it's a painful history, but it's also a story of resilience, resistance, persistence, creativity, and solidarity. So there's a real mix of emotions for people when they go through these galleries. The second floor includes Explore More, which is an area with digital interactives, along with classrooms, a library, and a family history center. The third floor, let's see, I want to make sure that I get to, this is the Great Hall where everyone enters. The third floor features exhibitions about community, sports, and military service. The fourth floor celebrates the arts and includes an art gallery and 2 exhibitions about the performing arts, one about music and the other called Taking the Stage. So in some ways, the museum was really built extraordinarily fast. It was only 13 years between the time the legislation was signed to the opening of the museum, and only 11 years the museum opened after the first staff member was hired. It was an amazing feat, and I will talk about that period, but I also want to talk about the idea behind the museum, that was really more than 100 years in the making. About 200,000 African-American men and boys served in the Civil War. Black people have served in every American war from the Revolution forward, and Black women served in both official and unofficial capacities also. In 1915, 50 years after the Civil War, the Grand Army of the Republic planned a 49th reunion in Washington, D.C. The GAR was an organization of Civil War veterans who served in the Union. Many Black veterans poured into the city for this celebration, and a committee had to be made to make sure they had a safe place to stay and eat, because they could not lodge in most hotels and they couldn't eat in most restaurants. The reunion and lack of respect for Black veterans inspired a committee to form a new organization, the National Memorial Association, for the erection of a monument at the national capitol in the honor of Negro soldiers and sailors who fought in the wars of our country. It's a long mouthful of a title, even longer than our current museum's title, and it was called the National Memorial Association for short. One of my favorite objects in the museum is this little pocket bank where people could save their change to build that memorial. Legislation was created to create a commission on the memorial, and it pended in Congress until 1920, but the bill died. Nevertheless, the committee persisted. The supporters of the memorial started to dream bigger. By the late 1920s, they had begun the campaign for a grand museum devoted to Black accomplishments. And then the legislation actually passed in 1929 to support the museum, but only $50,000 was appropriated, and it could not be used until the National Memorial Association had already raised $500,000. At that time, that was a huge sum, and in the Depression, it put the museum on hold for decades. In 1998, Congressman John Lewis introduced a bill for a museum of Black history and culture to join the Smithsonian, and it died without a hearing. Every year, Lewis introduced the legislation. In 2001, Lewis and Congressman J.C. Watts, plus 2 white senators, Max Cleland and Sam Brownback, sponsored a bill to establish a commission, and this time it passed. It issued a report. The report was called The Time Has Come, and it was published in 2003. The commission convened, and the report with an outline, and it gave an organizational structure, a collection strategy, a fundraising plan, a Smithsonian affiliation, and recommended a location on the National Mall. Later that year, the bill to create the museum was signed on December 16th, 2003. George W. Bush was the president who signed it into law. And I think it's interesting that in a way, it couldn't happen until the Republicans were on board and there was a Republican administration to get behind it. It really needed to be bipartisan. Lonnie Bunch, our director, was hired in 2005. All he had to work with was a dream and some money from Congress, which was really important. Tasha Coleman, his assistant, started with him, and then deputy director, Kinshasa Holman Conwell. And Lonnie always tells the story that on his first day on the job, he and Tasha showed up at the building where they're supposed to go, and they couldn't get in. They didn't have a key to the door, and they ended up breaking into the office. And he said that was kind of a metaphor for the whole difficulty of starting the museum. Basically, you know, this is what the museum had in 2003 when Lonnie started. They had nothing. In 2006, they announced a site, and now the museum just needed a building. And that was quite a battle to get the museum on the National Mall and not in Anacostia or in some other location. From the beginning, the advisory council for the museum felt it was really important that this museum have the same stature and the same prominence of place as the other major Smithsonian museums. In 2006, they just needed a building, collections, more staff, an exhibition strategy, and a lot more money. In 2007, they hired 2 curators, Dr. Jacqueline Surer and Dr. Michelle Gates-Moresi. And Lonnie put together a team of architects, museum planners, and exhibition designers to determine the needs and the goals for this museum. And also guiding the work were 2 committees that still serve the museum. The Museum Council, they're kind of our board of directors, leaders in industry, commerce, finance, basically people who had access to money and could help us raise funds. $300 million had been raised, but the museum really needed more than twice that to be successful. It was clear that in the end, much more we needed, and the council actually raised over $500 million in the course of the project. The other council is the Scholarly Advisory Council, and they were formed to help shape the intellectual agenda for the museum, the exhibition content and programming. The staff was primarily responsible for that, but the Scholarly Advisory Committee provided a lot of counsel. They were a sounding board. It also was a strategic move on the part of the director, so that when the museum opened and the questions came about why certain decisions were made and how certain stories were told, he would have this very august body of scholars behind him to say that, you know, these decisions were based on the latest scholarship, on, you know, the most effective ways of delivering museum stories, and to have kind of multiply the influence of important people who could talk knowledgeably about what was happening in the museum. They provided outstanding, if sometimes tough love advice, and it provided us cover. So for the commission and the construction, I'm showing a few key moments. There's the famous sketch on the napkin, which really does exist in the Smithsonian archives now by the chief architect, Ajay, but he also worked very closely with firms in the United States. It was a joint effort. Ajay is really a paper architect. He really knows how to design, you know, beautiful things on paper, but he needed to team up with engineers to make this building a possibility. Basically, the guiding lights that came out of the report and Lonnie's work with the Smithsonian Scholarly Council Advisory was these 4 pillars, and we still stand on these. Our museum still stands on these pillars. It's to create an opportunity, and I hate to read slides to people, but in this case I will. Create opportunity for those who care about African American history and explore and revel in this history. To use African American history and culture as a lens, a way to look at different way of being American, to tell the African American story in an international context, and to serve as a place of collaboration. So the idea wasn't that this museum would replace all the other African American institutions, the community centers. It was going to be a collaborator and try to support the work going on in local communities and in regions, in a way, give them cover, just the way the advisory council gave us a certain amount of cover. The organizing principle for the exhibitions in the museum and the presentation got boiled down to this bubble diagram. And I can't tell you how many times this was brought to meetings and sketched upon so people could kind of conceptualize how this was going to work. The collections we presented in these 3 broad categories, and you saw some photographs of the final galleries: history, community, and culture. And I'll show you some pictures from our some of our notable collections that we acquired fairly early on, in time to put them in the exhibition. This is the other thing when you're building a museum from scratch. There's a certain point at which, after you continue to acquire objects, you can no longer put them in the museum. The walls are built, the cases are ordered, the labels are done. So although the museum opened in 2016, the collecting effort really had to stop about 2 years earlier. Here are some wonderful things from our community collection. The community collection really one of the titles of one of the galleries sums up what the community is all about. And that is an expression called making a way out of no way, or making a way when there is no way. And that means, what do you do when the normal avenues to helping your family, helping your community, helping the nation are closed to you? What do you do when you can't join the local business society, or you can't get an account or a loan at a bank, or if you can't play on the same ball field? You basically rely on your own resources, and you create your own institutions to support your community. And that message goes all through all of the community galleries and really all of the museum. Here are some notable collections from our culture exhibition. We have a very small but growing and quite fine collection of paintings, sculpture, video, time-based media. I love this red Cadillac. It actually had been driven onto the stage during a Chuck Berry concert. There are photographs and old films of him using this as a prop. And we have an amazing collection of fashion that was based on a collection that was put together by Lois Alexander, first in New York and then in Washington. And these collections are all kind of gifts of the heart. Unlike a lot of other museums, the people who donated to the museum were really heavily invested in the success of the museum and wanted to be part of it. And because of that, they were extremely generous. The dress on the right is by a designer, the same designer who designed Jackie Kennedy's wedding gown, something that few people realize, that she had an African-American designer who worked for her. And this actual collection, which contains between 2,000 and 3,000 items, depending upon how you count, was started because Lois wanted to be a designer. And when she was in school, all of her teachers told her that there was no such thing as Black fashion or a fashion design industry. And she knew that was wrong. She knew that for centuries, Black women particularly had been designing and making their own clothes and clothes for other people, and that there were actually a lot of things that the African-American community had contributed to style and fashion. Oops. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble. There we go. Another big collection, which I'm just going to single out here, is our photography collection. We have almost more photographs than any other individual type of item. And that has been a real fascinating collection for me, and something that overlapped with my interests before I came to the museum. And I've been working on some publications that feature our photography collections. We also got some really big stuff, and some of that stuff had to be installed while the museum was still being built. And you see 2 of those on either side. One is a training plane for Tuskegee. The man who owned this plane, he bought it to fix it up. He had no idea what it was, and he was a a white man who had flown for the Air Force. And when he found out what it was, he got very involved with the group of Black Tuskegee airmen who still survived. And he used it at air shows all around the country. And when it finally came to the Smithsonian, it had one last flight across the country, and it was met on the Washington end by a group of surviving airmen. And on the left side is a Jim Crow rail car that we went down to watch this be lowered into the building. It was extremely dramatic. It was really fun to watch it kind of swung in the breeze and finally got put down. And this was a donation again by a man who collects rail cars. People do that, and wanted to find a good home for a Jim Crow railhead, which allows us to tell a story in a really vivid and relatable way. And the center is a cabin that was brought up from Point of Pines in South Carolina, from a plantation where there still survive many of the original cabinets. Of course, many parts replaced and done, but basically the same structures that people lived in well into the 1960s. Opening day was amazing. And in fact, I heard today from the head of special events that they have entered a contest called for the event of the decade. And it was our opening day celebration. I still get chills thinking about it. All of the museum staff was involved, was invited to go. We weren't very close, but we were there. And there was an amazing number of people who came to the museum, even though they knew they would not be able to get in on the first day. We were just overwhelmed. They just wanted to be in the city when this event happened. And it was really quite an extraordinary experience. So my contributions to the museum really are all behind the scenes, at least at this point. And some inform the exhibitions, and some are online or digital only. Digital stuff can be really engaging and powerful. And you can see here the Obama family engaged by a powerful interactive in our galleries. They came and they used this interactive that included items from our collection that we had digitized in different ways of arranging and rearranging them based on their community and where they came from. On the left-hand side, you can see we launched our site so you can search our collection on our website, and we did some kind of pre-curated groups of things so people could easily click on and find something, a group we thought would be interesting to the public. And on the right, the team that I work with created the catalog records that appear with the objects in the museum. But what is digitization? There are really a lot of different definitions of what it could be. And what I normally describe it is all the things that create the digital foundation for the museum. So it's the images we make, and it's the data or the metadata that we create. It's the surrogate. Sometimes if we have something like a video that is deteriorating, we'll make a copy, sometimes in the original material, sometimes in a new digital format. And then it's the records themselves, how all this comes together and can be delivered. And our aim when we created this digital foundation was to create what we called a culturally responsible database that was useful, reliable, relevant, and respectful. And we created it so that you can search by exhibition and institutional through lines, and about our values. Really, you can search for justice. You can search for things related to identity, civil rights, freedom, religion, and so on. And here we have a picture of one of our first photographers and our idea of what digitization can be. And if you don't know Ginger Smock, there's a wonderful story about her on our website, and I encourage you to do that as American History Month is coming up and Jazz History Month is coming up. Let's plug that. from the beginning, our director said that we'd be a digital first museum. And frankly, he had no idea what that meant, except that he knew that the future meant that the museum's presence would be as much on the web as it would be on the ground, and probably not as quickly as we thought with COVID, but we really are almost entirely digital right now. And also that we would start from the very beginning building a museum that lent itself to digitization and to digital. And I know there's some art historians in the audience here, but if you look at the way that museums normally kept data around their collections, it tended to be driven by the person who was taking care of or responsible for the objects, the curators, and it was mainly created for their own use. It wasn't really meant to be shared with the public. It was meant to be data that would be used to create an exhibition catalog or a museum exhibition, or to be able to find something in storage, but it never really was meant to be delivered to the public. And as a result, most museums have a huge legacy of material that is not really ready to go online. And that can be a huge, huge burden. I think Melanie, as a librarian, could talk about the shift that libraries had to make to digital was similar, moving from paper records to the online world, except that in this case, every museum thinks it's a unique snowflake, and there's no like universal cataloging like there is for books and libraries. So that was a really important thing for the museum, and it made my job at the museum a lot easier because I had a lot of support from the very beginning on building this digital foundation and allowing us to take advantage of being digital first. Let's see. So there are a lot of different ways that we can use the digital information, and some of them I've alluded to. It helps us keep track of what we have. It lets the curators know what we have. It helps us do exhibitions, but it also has turned out to be a really powerful way to engage with the public. And one of the most interesting ways, I think, is through our transcription center. And if you're ever having a boring day under COVID, I encourage you to go there. Basically, it's a pan-Smithsonian site where you can look at original documents from the collection. And now also you can listen to original audio files. And you help the museum by collaborating with many other, we call them volunteers around the world, who help to transcribe these documents. And this is extremely helpful because the staff at the museum just does not have time to do this. And it also allows these documents to be keyword searchable in a way they weren't before they were transcribed. We have had tremendous success with the Transcription Center. We're hosting 2 big projects. One of them is based on our collection, and I'll talk a little bit more about this specific collection in front of you in a moment. And then the other is through the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau of Refugees, freedmen, and others was created right near the end of the Civil War to help newly unenslaved people who had left slavery, how to become citizens. It was meant to be a kind of bridge between their old life and their new life. And it was sometimes successful and sometimes not. But because it was a big government organization, they left millions of records, and we're slowly transcribing those records now. By the end of this quarter, which for us is in May, we'll have transcribed 200,000 pages of the 1.4 million images that we have. So that will really change the way we look at things. The other thing we do is we work on collection objects, and flat objects are easy to digitize. So we have a lot of them, and we have a lot of documents. And but until you can really know what they say and how they can be used, they're not very useful. So here I just put one example up here of, I think, a really powerful way that digitization can be used, both to engage the public in doing real museum work, helping people understand why it's important to save these kinds of documents, and also exposing people to primary sources that can really make a history which might seem distant become quite immediate. So in this case, what I'm showing you is one of document of 79 that were a gift of Mr. Liljenquist in Washington. He collects photography and documents related to the slave era. And these documents were all part of the plantation operation documents, the business documents for a plantation in Essex County, Virginia. And, you know, every object in our collection and document has with it at least one powerful story. Many of them have several. And sometimes the story is hidden and it really needs to be interpreted. But sometimes the story is, you know, really right in plain sight. So this piece of paper, a slip of paper, is a slave catcher's receipt. The justice of the peace recorded the story of Braxton, an enslaved man who liberated himself. And then Braxton was captured by Silas Goulding and was returned to his enslaver, Edward Rusey, by Goulding. Goulding was paid $5 for the apprehension and 10 cents a mile to take him back to the Rusey plantation. So for $5, Goulding was willing to see Braxton return to be enslaved. And a look at this one document tells us so much about the institution of slavery. It talks about the agency of the enslaved, how over and over people who were enslaved did try to resist the system and get out of it. It shows the human desire to be free, even though it's very costly. And you can ensure that when Braxton got back to where he was, he paid for his trying to leave. It talks about the twisted judicial system that supported it. You know, our collection is really an effort to bear witness to people like Braxton and places like Essex County and events like Braxton's Run Toward Freedom that have consistently been marginalized by mainstream museums. And we want to make these people, places, and events known using our collection to have an impact. So we're not just at the museum, we're also online, and our goal is not just to educate people, but also to help change people's hearts and minds. And that's all. That's that.
Thank you, Laura. That was really amazing. I remember I had my first library internship in 2016, and we were going on a kind of field trip, and we had all really wanted to go to the Museum of African American History and Culture, but it was, you know, the line was out the door and you couldn't get a spot to go in. So we didn't get the opportunity then, but it's so exciting to hear about all your efforts to be a digital first museum. That's incredible. That's really wonderful.
Yeah, and it really paid off when we had to close because of COVID. I mean, my department is really pretty small. You know, I have one full-time permanent photographer and a handful of contractors and trust people and one full-time cataloger. But we've been able to do a lot with, you know, the support of the institution and resources. And that really helped us a lot when we had to close the museum because we always told people like Melanie, well, we're going to be around for the ages. Come back, you know, it's going to get easier to get in, and it has. And we now have new procedures where you can get a same-day ticket and a standby ticket. We really are trying to facilitate getting as many people into the building as possible. But suddenly that was completely out of our control. So the museum really pivoted. The whole staff moved off site, and we tried to make as many things available online. And I have to tell you that the main programs that the museum does, they just did a program online with about a new book about 400 years of African American history based on essays by 80 essayists who wrote short essays. And we had 7,200 people tune in to listen to the book talk. You know, and this is, you know, our auditorium fits 350 people. And we always did live cast. but we never got that many people. Now I think it's not going to go away. I mean, we have now engaged this audience, and we want to keep growing it, and realize that there really is a huge audience out there for digital experiences. Not that it will never replace the museum. They're complements. They really work together, and I really strongly encourage you to go when you can go back in. It's an amazing experience. But we're lucky that we were able to have some kind of online presence during this period.
Yeah, I think many cultural heritage institutions are realizing that the future is this kind of hybrid model of having the virtual as well as the physical institutions, which is amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to check in the chat and see if any folks have any questions. It looks like one of our participants, Alex, asked, does the museum have any other automobiles as part of its collection? And does the museum continue to add items to its collection?
It has part of an automobile. It's not actually in the collections. It's a car from the 1940s, and I'm sorry that I don't remember the make. And it's sort of cut in half so that you can be as if you're sitting in the car, and it has a video screen. It's in the exhibition, it's in the part of the museum called Explore More, which are some of the educational galleries. And there's an interactive there that talks about what it was like to travel through the Jim Crow South by car, and why the car became such an important part of African-American culture, what that meant. And then there's an exercise that you can do with this car where it'll give you choices. You know, it's like, what should we put in the trunk? Like, should we include a bag lunch? You know, should we include this? You know, do we think how can we tell if this is a safe place to stop? And there's a feature about, you know, within that about the green books, which were travel guides for African Americans who could use going to the South. So we have it as we would call it an exhibition prop, but it's a pretty remarkable thing. I'm trying to think, we don't have any other vehicles. We haven't offered them, but we haven't accepted them. We are still collecting. We are not collecting the same unbelievably frantic way we were collecting between 2000 and about 11 and 2015, but we are still actively collecting. Our photography collection has grown hugely, and that's a relatively easy kind of collection to store and to share and to exhibit. So that's an important place where we're growing, but we're collecting in all the areas. And I think one of the more exciting places we're collecting right now are people's experiences related to COVID-19 and the social justice and unrest in the country. So there are, you know, two major Smithsonian collecting initiatives, and we're participating in both. And they are collecting both physical things like signs from protests, but also oral histories and memories of people who are involved in those, you know, in feeling the impact of those two really big parts of our culture right now.
I have just to interject quickly, a follow-up question to that. So you guys are still collecting, but can you tell us a little bit more, how were you even able to stop collecting in 2015? You know, I'm sure the interest was just so intense that
yeah, it was. And we've one of the things we do try to do on the website is to manage people's expectations, because we did get such an enormous number of things offered to the museum, and it takes time for the curators to you know, to get through them and see them. And because we are really trying to be mindful that we can't collect everything, that we have to make some really difficult choices. So it's important for that choice to be thoughtful. It's also important for the curators to have a chance, or conservators, to see the actual objects. Sometimes it's to make sure that they are authentic. You know, people in good, you know, in good faith can offer things that turn out not to be what they thought they were, or to make sure that they are in a condition that we can continue to care for them. We don't want to, you know, accept something that we can't take care of well, which is one of the reasons we didn't accept more vehicles. They just take up so much space. You can have, there's no place to exhibit them and keep them on view, so we would have to store them in a particular kind of place. And that message went out to our members through our members newsletter. It went through the website to let people know that we were extremely grateful for the donations, that we would still like to accept them, but also to explain that we wouldn't be able to accept everything. And when we can't, but we can think of a place where it would be appropriate, we will try to steer that collector to regional or local collection. And that's a goal of the museum too, as I said at the beginning, not to be the only place where you can go and learn about this history. It's supposed to also inspire communities and towns to collect their own history so they can tell the stories about the place where they live and the history of a fuller history, a more inclusive history of where they live, using objects as a vehicle to do that.
That's great. And that actually segues nicely into our next question, which is, can you tell us a little bit more about the Black Fashion Museum? Where is that? And
yeah.
yeah.
It was originally in Harlem, and then it moved to a townhouse in Washington, and it was a very informal museum. It was basically Lois Alexander and her collection and everything that was that she kept. It wasn't a really official institution. She had a lot of trouble raising money to support it, and she really wasn't ready to donate it earlier in her life. And actually, in truth, there wasn't a place that would accept it until our museum came about. And by the time the museum was under construction, she was in poor health, but was able to work with her daughter to negotiate the donation with the museum. But it had to happen very, very rapidly. Basically, she was being moved out of her townhouse, and everything needed to be out of the house within a very short period of time. And I have stories from Michelle Gates Moraise and Jackie Sewer, who were really the only two curators at the museum at that time, driving in their own vehicles. We didn't have a van, we didn't have any Smithsonian support, backing up their hatchbacks and just like putting as much as possible into the back of the car and then dropping it off at the storage place and then going back. This is really not the standard way. This is not a best practice for transferring collections, but it really was, if they hadn't acted, the collection would have been dispersed. The daughter didn't have the means or the interest to be able to maintain it. It had become so big that it was, all consuming for one person to try to take care of. And the materials, as they were aging, were becoming damaged. They really needed to be looked at more carefully. So we are still sifting through that collection. We don't have what we would call intellectual control over that collection. They were able to find particular highlights of the collection, like those gorgeous gowns. And we have some of the original costumes from The Wiz, and we have things by noted contemporary designers, and we have things that are associated with enslaved people, made by enslaved people. And we also received an archive. But until we really have a dedicated project, which I think is actually going to launch this year, to go systematically through that archive and create a proper finding aid so that the archive can help document the garments that are in the collection. Until then, the amount of that collection that's online is limited. But you can search for the Black Fashion Collection on our website, and you can see a number of the most important things, including a dress that Rosa Parks was working on the year that she helped to lead the boycott. She was a seamstress and made her own clothes, and she was very interested in fashion, and that ended up in the Black Fashion Museum. It's the kind of thing that no place else would have thought to collect, because
Right.
they thought it was important, and now it just seems like such a way to understand Rosa Parks in a completely different and really personal kind of way. So I'm not sure if I answered that question. The museum, as a museum, it never really was open to the public. It was more of a private collection that people made appointments and went to see.
And so basically anything in that collection that exists is what you guys have.
Pretty much, yeah. And we're going through it. I mean, there's some things that we probably won't keep, like just bits of tissue paper and, scraps of fabric. But it's going to take a long time to go through it really carefully and make sure that we've sifted out anything that doesn't need to be kept in forever, and then make sure they've really taken care of. Before we had a conservation department, Museum Conservation Institute, which is a scientific research institute for the Smithsonian, took on the project of doing a first run through most of the boxes and did initial condition reports and kind of identified what they could tell were the most important things and made sure that they were put, say, in acid-free boxes and stuff with acid-free tissue and laid. But there's still a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done on that collection.
Can imagine. All right, our next question. Laura, can you say a little something about the collection efforts that you did around the country and the community digitization?
Yes, so there are two different programs that the museum was engaged in and is engaged in now. The first was called African American Treasures. And I think the director's original idea was that he would go from community to community, and they would invite people to bring in personal collections, photographs and quilts, no weapons and nothing over a certain size, but really it was whatever people wanted to bring. And it was a way of kind of finding out what was out in the community. When the museum was proposed and approved, there were many, many people who maintained that there wasn't enough existing material to fill a museum of African American history. And my director and the people who were doing that, they knew that intuitively, but they needed a way to demonstrate that. So going out into the community and bringing these things to the surface was one way that they could make the point that those things were out there. And it also was a way that we could do some collecting, but it really became quickly apparent to the director that that really wasn't the right approach. And that changed into a program where people could bring what they had to help them identify it and figure out how to take care of it. And if they wanted to donate it, to direct them where in the local area they could place that collection. It was one of many different things the director did to make sure that people understood the museum existed before there was even a hole in the ground, that the museum as an idea and as the set of programs and exhibitions existed. And that was very important for fundraising, but it also helped build huge excitement for the museum rather than waiting until everything to the last minute. The other effort was funded a few years ago by Robert Smith, who is a very wealthy African American entrepreneur and venture capitalist. And he was very interested in helping people digitize their collections across generations. So his vision was that families would get together and figure out what in their collections needed to be saved, and that the museum would help them to help them save it. So that in its entirety was the first idea, and it kind of evolved into helping people save mostly flat materials. So photographs, documents, cards and letters, all kinds of things that ended up in people's families. And basically a team of people go out to a city and set up. Sometimes we do a long program for up to 2 weeks, as we did in Chicago and in Denver. And sometimes it'll be a day or two, as we've done in Baltimore. But again, we invite people to bring their materials and make an appointment to have those materials digitized. We also do media, home movies and video. And in this case, the materials that are digitized go back to the owners, and the digital assets also go too. We don't collect a copy of those, they go back to the community. We've also partnered with local institutions, with smaller institutions, and in that case, we will help them digitize the materials, and then provided they are willing, they can donate a set of the digitized materials to the museum, and that becomes part of the museum's study collection. And that's important because some of the places that have had their collections digitized don't necessarily have the infrastructure and the funds to get the stuff they digitized out to the public easily. So if we add it to our collection, there's a good sense that those will be preserved, even if that takes a long time on the local level, and eventually we'll be able to make it available too. So it'll be available in both places.
Wow, that's awesome. Right. Our next question is all of your collection housed in the museum, or do you also have offsite storage?
We have offsite storage. And in fact, we have offsite offices. The plot that the museum is on was one of the last on the mall. It was an odd shaped lot between the Washington Monument and the National History Museum. And they did as much as they could within the limitations of the site, including that there's water underneath the site, there's a creek that runs below the mall, and it's on kind of unsturdy ground. There was a point when they were digging the hole for the museum. They were worried the vibration might tip over the Washington Monument, and everyone agreed that that would be a really terrible thing to have happen in terms of publicity for the museum. So that had to be redesigned. And there's also height limits in Washington of how high you can make a building.
Sure.
So we couldn't go down too deep and we couldn't go up too high. And the director really wanted to have a very beautiful building, which doesn't mean it's the most efficient building for exhibitions or for collection storage or for office space. He made the right decision. It's a beautiful space. It's extremely inspiring. But the practical end is that only a small percentage of our exhibition is on view at any one time, and the rest of it is in the storage facility about 8 miles east on the other side of the Capitol, where there's a great big warehouse where there are a number of different Smithsonian units that store their collections. And that's also where the digitization experts who do imaging are also based near the collection, because that's efficient for them. And our conservation lab is also on that same site. So no, there's only a small amount. We have a small amount of transitional storage. So when we're bringing things in for an exhibition, there's a safe place to lock it up before it actually gets installed into the exhibition and vice versa. But the vast majority of the collection that's not on view is in storage offsite.
Our next question is, how has the museum thought about diversity of their staff, and how has this affected the process of exhibiting work?
Yeah, we are by far the most diverse museum in the Smithsonian. Absolutely, no, hands down. And let's see, most of the directors have all been African American, and the deputy director. Most of the associate directors are African American, but not all. Most of the curators are African American, but not all. Really, the idea is to find the best person for the particular task. And many of the major scholars and museum people for African American history and culture are African American, but there are also people of other races who are interested in those topics. And there's all exhibitions are like a paper or an essay. They all have a perspective and a point of view. And the extent to which the museum speaks with one voice is really a kind of conscious decision. In many places, many museums, they try to speak with one universal viewpoint for the entire institution. And I'd say that's a bit different in our museum. The interests and the strengths of the particular curators do come out in the different exhibitions. They have different perspectives, but all through the lens of African American culture. So there are certain kind of values and stories that are shared throughout the museum, but the particular choices in which ones are told and how they're told are primarily a curatorial decision. And then the director, of course, has oversight over the entire place. You know, you have a way of kind of backing things up or not. And you'll see in the paper, it's impossible to get everything in that people think should be in the museum. And addressing that is, you know, that's one of the director's charges and burdens, to be able to explain that. So I think it's, you know, it's extremely important that the people who are deciding how to tell the story understand the story, and understanding the story from a first person perspective is something that no one else can replicate. So that's very important in our museum. I don't know if I really addressed that question, but the idea is that we'd like to be a model for the rest of Smithsonian, which is overwhelmingly white, even in the in museums where you might not expect that, and that's partially a function of the field and the nature of how people get hired and get ahead in the field. There are a lot of informal networks that depend on knowing people and going through the right graduate program, or those kinds of connections, which can make it unintentionally a very closed community. And we're trying to figure out how to change that. For example, there are a lot of contract jobs at Smithsonian, and generally they don't get advertised outside the Smithsonian. So it means you're always talking to the same group of people that you're hiring in the same kind of connections. So opening up those networks and diversifying the networks has been really important. And also doing things like making sure that all internships are paid. You know, that means that a whole different group of people are able to take advantage of them that they couldn't before. And I would say it's maybe changing a little bit now, but back in the day, I think that 85% of the people I knew who worked in museums started with an unpaid internship. So that right there tells you, you know, what kind of access a vast number of people had, not much at all. So the salaries are also extremely low. We're lucky at Smithsonian. We're much more competitively paid in terms of for our work with you know, people of similar education in the universities and elsewhere. But again, the amount of money that museum jobs paid for such a long time and continue to pay in many, many places, it doesn't make economic sense for people who really have to depend 100% on that job to take care of them, or may not have, you know, the kind of safety net that many of us had, where we could take a low-paying job and know that if we lost it, we weren't, you know, we had people to fall back on who would make sure that we'd be okay. It's a very complicated thing, but I think that the Smithsonian is stronger when it has more different kinds of voices. And it's been an incredible experience for me to live within a place where I'm the minority. And I think that that's a really good experience. I hadn't had that before, and it's interesting and humbling and educational, and something that I really value out of the job.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you for, you know, touching on that point on a variety of levels. It's really interesting to hear about, you know, the sort of institutional changes you're seeing in the museum and cultural heritage industry and things like that. All right, looks like our last question right now is, did the pre-existing Smithsonian museums transfer any of the items from their collections to the African American Museum?
Oh, that's a great question. No, very, very few were transferred. We do have some loans from other museums, but the director thought, and I think he was right, he didn't want to consolidate everything related to African Americans in one place. Our museum was meant to be a place where that is the lens, and you really get the level of detail and the amount of storytelling and interest in that perspective is intense, and 100% in our museum, and that's what we wanted. But the idea wasn't to completely segregate the collections. And it was really important to make sure that important artifacts related to African American life and culture remained in other Smithsonian museums, so that they would be seen in the context of the larger culture and how they relate to the larger culture. So that was a very conscious decision. It would have been easier if we had just transferred a whole lot of stuff from American history. What we also found too is that by building our own collection, suddenly American history was much more interested in their African American material than they had been before.
Right.
So that was also, you know, that I think that they thought it wasn't all that important, and then saw what a huge audience there was for seeing this kind of material and telling these stories, that they've gone back to their own collections and have started to use them in a more inclusive way.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. Does anybody else have any other questions? I've come to the end of the chat, so please speak now if you would like to ask Laura any more questions. And as I said earlier, this recording or this session has been recorded, and we will be posting it to the library website. So feel free to let your friends and family know about it, and you can absolutely share it with them once it is posted. And since it doesn't look like we've got any more questions, I just want to take the final opportunity to thank you again so much, Laura. This was really wonderful. I know I got a lot out of it, and I think everybody else did too. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. And I want to thank everyone for coming, especially my daughter, Mariana, and her good friend, Adina. Thank you so much for coming. I'll talk to you soon, sweetie. And take care, everyone.
Thanks,
It
Laura.
really was a pleasure. And
Thank
thank you so much for the Eastham Library. It really means a lot to me.
Oh, thank you. Have a good one, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.